Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to do so. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this critical conversation series that the Russian Studies workshop at Indiana University, I believe started 2 or 3 years ago. So that's now a tradition to have critical conversation series every spring, critical conversation in Russian studies. And I'm really delighted to have our moderator, visiting scholar at Indiana University and also professor from European University in St. Petersburg, Ilya Utekhin, to organize and moderate this panel. And he will introduce our panelists that we have to discuss a really important matter today, the news, how the Russians get and what they can do with the news now. So thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours, Ilya. I'm passing you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for your introduction. And it is my pleasure to introduce our participants who make today's panel really unique. Well, the person who has not joined yet, but we are expecting her to join, is Elaine Monaghan. She is professor of practice at Indiana University Media School. She's teaching journalism and leading the Observatory on Social Media. Elaine worked for Reuters as a reporter in Russia and the former USSR and was responsible for the coverage of the events in Ukraine and Belarus in some of the most dramatic periods of the recent history. Lev Gershenzon, who is with us today, was head of Yandex News aggregator during the best years of the existence of the service, with a multi-million audience reach daily. And currently, he is developing a new project of a news aggregator. It is a startup that has not yet conquered the world of the Russian news consumption, but definitely has this aspiration. And Vasily Gatov is media analyst, the leading media expert on Russia. Currently, he's a fellow of University of South California Center on Communication Leadership and Policy. And during more than the last 3 decades, Vasily was at the center of a number of outstanding Russian media projects. He created RIA Novosti Media Lab and was head of the lab up to the moment when RIA Novosti was reorganized. So I'm happy that our panelists agreed to join us today. Thank you. Let me introduce the topic of our panel. We will discuss the current state of the Russian news media. And if we met for this purpose before February 24th of the last year, we would have many interesting things to comment on. And we would mention that during the last few years, the Russian authorities were consolidating media in the hands of the loyal owners affiliated with the state, and also were imposing all sorts of limitations on independent media. We would most probably say that Roskomnadzor, as a watchdog with power to recall licenses and initiate prohibitions of the websites, it was instrumental for this process, especially because the authorities were looking for ways to control not only TV channels, but also internet, in order to dictate the agenda that for traditional media was being set each week by the office of the president. We would also touch upon social media in Russia. By the time when COVID pandemic began, social media and news aggregators were among the main channels for news to arrive to people. My own experience at a startup aimed at the development of a news aggregator showed that if we looked to the news feeds generated by the main media outlets, we could see 2 different and even opposing news agendas, one promoted by pro-Kremlin media and the other by the independent and not fully controlled media that remain. These 2 agendas are only partly overlapping, and even when media from both groups reported on the same event, they might construe it so differently that it was not actually the same event, but rather 2 different events in the same place and same time. Today, we hold our meeting in a situation when the war in Ukraine has catalyzed the changes in the Russian news media, tightening the rules of the game and expelling abroad most of the independent news sources. These days, VPN services are widely used by a part of the Russian population in order to have access to the news from the foreign agents and undesirable organizations. So it would be great to approach to the understanding what's new and what's special about the current state of affairs in terms of news productions and news consumption in Russia. I would like to start by asking this very broad question to our experts who have their own particular objects and who pay attention to different aspects of the topic. If Elaine is not yet here, I would like to ask Lev to start. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ilya, and thank you for the introduction. And I'm happy to take part in this panel. Just a couple of words about my background. In fact, it's true that I've been working for Yandex and leading the Yandex news aggregator for some 5 years, but the last 10 years I was fully in some other activities. I was working on developing a small startup, a search engine for e-commerce, so that had nothing to do with news. But after the war started, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, after the first days of shock, some feelings that a lot of people with Russian origins of Russian citizenship felt, I realized that my former employees, my former colleagues were playing really a huge role in spreading the propaganda and informing the minds of Russian citizens, concerning the war. And that the service I was working on for, as I mentioned, 5 years, wasn't a news service, wasn't a news aggregator no more, but something completely different. A machine for mass spreading the propaganda. Actually, the lies or some messages, narratives that were convenient for the Kremlin, for the war party to persuade the people, the Russian people, that it's not a war, that no war crimes were committed, that it's not an invasion, it's some kind of special war operation, and so on and so on. And the first attempt was to somehow appeal to my former colleagues and to persuade them that it's worth do something to change the situation, not just to be like the soldiers in the army and in the war that they didn't choose. But when I failed as the manager, as a product and project manager, a simple idea came to my mind that it wasn't even a decision, that it's worth trying and to build something differently, or something that would fit into the former ideas and principles that we used to use in our previous work. And that's how the idea of the True Story news aggregator appeared. I wrote a post in Facebook just for friends only, that I'm willing to start this project, and received a surprisingly huge amount of responses. And that's how the project, so well, it's some 11 months ago, this project started. So why news aggregator, and why, how does it relate to the topic of the current discussion, the current panel? The situation with news consumption in Russia is, I believe, but hopefully Vasily will correct me later, is unique In what sense? Because, well, Russia is one of the very few countries where Google wasn't the only and the leading search engine. And it was and still is Yandex. And the other important difference, unique feature of the market, on the landscape, is that this search engine has its main page with a news block with the full automatic news headlines, news stories on the main page. And the audience, so this is like the small part, the top part of the Yandex News service. It was and maybe still is made fully automatically, not to mention maybe some manually applied censorships. And there are not so many countries in the world. For example, in Europe or in the United States, it's like MSN or Bing, but Google on its main page has no news at all. And in Russia, these huge web portals, number one is, of course, Yandex, but there are some smaller ones like Rambler or mail.ru. They all have this big, well noticeable news section. And this is like this for decades already, for at least 20 years maybe. And these web portals are one of the main sources or initial starting points where users, where Russian people get the news information, the information about what's happening in the world, in the country around them. It would be interesting if, I'm unaware of such researchers to compare this situation with situation in other countries. But I just wanted to show you a couple of slides about the sources of audience of three different but well-known and pretty old news websites, Russian news websites, just to give you like some feeling what is it like, and maybe we'll have some time to discuss it later. It's not a research, I have to admit, it's just my observations, mainly based on one source. It's also the very old, how does it work? Sorry. I'll start with RIA Novosti news outlet, a prominent, maybe the biggest and the most famous news agency in Russia. So this chart shows that the black section, the black slice, corresponds to like direct visits. I think this slice can be considered as a real loyal visitors, readers that currently, constantly choose this website as the source of the information. And that's just, well, not more than 11%. And I have to repeat that RIA Novosti started their life in internet more than, I believe, 20 years ago. So it's really a long run. And the main source is Yandex, and more precisely the recommendation engine. So I just combined the news recommendation or media recommendation engine, the Zen service, with the news service, Yandex News, that are currently, maybe they belong to another company like VK Social Network, but I'm not sure if it's true or not. It doesn't matter actually. And another interesting thing is that Google, and here I also like combined both Google News, Google discovery that's used mostly by all users of Android smartphones in Russia. So this section is not that big in RIA Novosti because, well, after, if I'm not mistaken, maybe also Vasily will correct me, after the beginning in the first days after the invasion of Ukraine, Google made some moves and openly like banned a number of well-known state news agencies and newspapers, and RIA Novosti and Russia Today among them. Yeah, and the exchange section is also combine all the sources like banner exchange networks that are pretty popular in Russia. So another example is Lenta.ru. It's maybe also one of the oldest and well-known initially internet news website. And here the situation is a bit different. Yandex is also number one, like the biggest news source, but the like loyal, yeah, the direct visits are also somewhere around 10%, but there is an unknown zone like this other section. Maybe a part of it, a fraction of it can also be considered as the recurrent loyal visitors, maybe something else. But the third thing, the third example, it's so-called most known like business newspaper. And this source is widely present, quite good present in Google Discovery Service, and we can see that the Yandex and Google are almost like have the same shares in the source of information, in the source of the visitors of this website. But again, the direct visits are somewhere around 10%. What conclusions can we come like observing these pictures? And this is really scary for me, but I'd like to discuss it. That in Russia, there is very few like news readers or news consumers that really know at least what's the source of information they're consuming. Yeah, it's like a huge news swamp where tens of millions of Russian people are swimming, and or they're being fed with some texts or messages or narratives, not knowing what are the primary sources or the sources, or at least what's the name of the website where they are reading these. And yeah, that's something worth analyzing and discussing, and maybe I'll put a comma here.
Thank you very much, Lev. So you actually say that among internet users, most of them do not get in touch with the news directly at the media outlet website, but via aggregators and some other places, maybe via social media, and that there are important technological factors that influence this situation. It's very, very interesting. Thank you so much. Vasily, could you please continue?
Yeah, I will try to expand a bit of perspective. Lev, as an internet specialist, an internet person, is mostly concerned about digital consumption, but still about half of the Russian population, especially the older half, is consuming traditional media, primarily television, to lesser extent radio, and to lesser extent printed press. The kind of using the traditional media metrics like reach, internet, major internet news sites, including Yandex Novosti, they have a kind of a reach, which is how many percent, how large is the percent of people who predominantly use like this service. So the largest reach numbers that any Russian website has is the front page of Yandex, closely seconded by front page of Mail.ru, with the reach of about 18%. So 18% of Russians gather their primary information from these two web pages, and these combined is about 30%. So some of the audience is shared. When we take a look at the reach numbers of the television, and here I refer almost fully to what once was Gallup Media and now is Mediascope. So the Channel 1 and Channel 2 Russia combined have a reach of about, I'm making a theatrical pause, 57%. So this way or another, 57% of the population still get most of their news and entertainment from TV. In this regard, Russia is much more alike Latin countries, which have oversized share of television consumption. And because both major channels plus number of so-called independent ones are instrumentally controlled by the presidential administration, almost everything what they consume is censored, is manipulated, and is filled with propaganda. The part brought to people by internet, especially after kind of recent blocks by Roskomnadzor on most of social networks available in Russia, we can probably kind of expect people to be more indoctrinated, more kind of blind to alternatives, and kind of not really desperate to know the alternative view over current events. Since 2014, especially, but it started a bit earlier, Russian mass media, the kind of the largest Russian media sources, started to develop what I would call an alternative reality in propaganda models and tropes. Not only this creates a significant difference between their perception of how the country lives, how the world around the country lives, what happens in the neighboring countries, and what attitudes are supported or purported by the nation in general. That alternative reality is aggressive. It's anti-Western and especially anti-American. It's simplified, as usually propaganda is. And it's black and white. So we are good, everybody else is bad. And because this, and I think Ilya here could probably be a very authoritative source, because this is, in a way, kind of a continuation, a continued development of the narratives of the Soviet textbooks, historical textbooks and other, that still the majority of population had been going through during their school years, that seeds are falling into rich soil of conspiracy theories, of exaggerated assumptions, of excessive jingoism and kind of abnormal versions of patriotic feelings, and colonial things, because I mean Russia as country and Russians as a nation are very much infected by imperialism in its worst form, because it's almost as close to Nazi ideas of kind of cultural and physical prevalence as it could be, and therefore I would say, I mean, Lev kind of used the metaphor of like it's a pool of bad news Russians are swimming in. I would say it's a pool of really kind of poisonous things, because not only these things are manipulated, not only they contain direct lie, but they also make a long-lasting negative effect on consciousness and general understanding of the reality. That's my statement. If you have particular questions, I mean, I can expand on that. But generally, kind of what we currently observe in Russian media kind of landscape is something that that doesn't have to exist. I mean, this is awful. This is tragic. This is dangerous for the rest of the world, and most important, it's very dangerous for Russians themselves.
Thank you, Vasily. It's a very deep statement indeed, and thank you for expanding our view to the general population of news consumption. And I would like to emphasize your idea that news consumption and choice of sources resonates with people's values and convictions. And I would like to direct our discussion to this precisely topic of the audiences and the reactions to these or that messages. So the general question is, what we know about the audiences and their choices and their expectations that are met or not by these or that news sources. Lev, could you please give some details if you know something about the audiences of this digital consumption of news? So who are the users? We know that basically, because Yandex had this aggregator panel on the starting page, practically all the internet users in Russia were consumers of this news. But how do you evaluate the audience of the true story, and how you consider what strategy can be used with this goal in view of reaching broader audience. What do you know about your audience, and what use cases come to your mind?
Thank you. Yeah, I would pick the word choices that you said. Yeah, and it's always or very often this question in the West arises. Yeah, how can Russian people? Why do they do these choices? Why do they choose these news sources? Why do they listen to this poison? I fully agree with Vasily, because, well, it's not just toxic, it's poisonous, it's really dangerous. And if you are not got used to listening to it, it's really hard to endure. Yeah, well, listening to the Russian TV, because, well, the level of the hatred and the violence and the hate is so high that you can feel it. Yeah, and just imagine that Russian people are living, having I don't know, some 3 or 4 TV sets in their apartments, like in every room and in the kitchen necessarily, and they are always like constantly surrounded by TV and radio there. Yeah, so, well, if you or when you tend to ask about the choices, you have to keep this in mind. And also, and yeah, let me again show you the last slide that I missed in my first part. It's about the overall like news sources in the internet. Vasily is absolutely right, but I also added some absolute numbers here. So, well, these numbers cover some 40 million of users daily, and around 20 to 260 something million of web pages. But I have to add that here only websites with the Liru counters are calculated. So the real number might be 50% or even 2 times higher, actually. So, well, I'm not sure if the numbers that Vasily mentioned about the reach of 30% in internet, they're correct. I don't have some alternative reliable numbers in front of me right now, but what I know that in the first week after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the audiences of all known websites surged dramatically. And Yandex, it wasn't like the regular 30 million of daily users of the main page. The numbers were like 100 million. So, well, it means that for the short period where, and Ilya, sorry, I'm trying to answer your question actually, even if it doesn't look like this. I mean, everyone, almost every family, every household realized that something extraordinary happened. Yeah, despite the attempts of the government, the Kremlin, to persuade that everything is under control, there is no war happening, because, well, war is a trigger word for all Russians. Yeah, and that's why the fight against this exact war is so, well, fierce and so cruel, I would say. And a lot of people are already in jail for just using this word. Yeah, and despite all that efforts, a lot of people, maybe in the majority of the Russian population, realized that something extraordinary happened. And then at this moment, they turned off their TV sets and went to the internet like an alternative, because, well, they all, or most of them, realized that there is one truth maybe spread through the TV channels and some alternative in the internet. And now I want you to have a look at the picture and this chart, because, well, the other dichotomy exists. Like, there is Yandex, a Russian internet company, and there is Google. And the Google slice here, or 2 main Google slices, like Google search, it's when people explicitly ask something, name some topics, type in some queries, the information about what they want to receive. And the Android app is this Google recommendations, Google Discovery, this news recommendations that people receive when they only want to start surfing the internet. They haven't clicked any links yet. They haven't asked any questions. They haven't entered any queries, but they just open the browser and they already receive something. And these are the slices. They correspond to some different maybe groups of audience. The Android smartphones, they I'm generalizing and it's not correct, but still it might be useful and it roughly might correspond to some truth. Android smartphones are significantly cheaper than iPhones, for example. And maybe among journalists and media managers, and that's one of the reasons that I noticed that Google also played a major role in spreading the propaganda and in letting people or showing and sending, I would say, people to Russian propaganda news resources, news websites later, much later than the situation with Yandex, because, well, I also am an owner of an iPhone, and I'm not the audience of this Google Discovery. And these are, so I would say that all so-called simple Russians, most of them, they have this Chinese or Korean or some other smartphones operated by Android. And all of them, each time, sorry for repeating it, each time they just want to find something or to do something on the internet, they get this recommendations, and it means that it's mostly clickbait headlines, so something or teaser headlines, and people just click there because, well, they're interested in what will be the ending, or there are some, I don't know, lifestyle news, and the ingestion of propaganda might be very little, very tiny, not noticeable, but it will be there. And at the same time, Google pessimizes the independent news sources because, well, they are blocked by Roskomnadzor, and that's why technically they are not displayed on top of search results page, so even in the Google search, because, well, Google thinks that they are technically not that good and they are not worth showing to broader audience. And the third thing is that Google, by promoting these propaganda resources, it's like directly financing these propaganda websites because, well, there are a lot of ads on their pages and they can earn money. Despite all their opposition blocked news websites that are like cut off the standard monetization in YouTube, they can't earn money in Russia, and so, well, but it's another blow that they get from Google. So what I want to say that it's sad to confess, but still I believe that a lot of people just don't do any choices. They don't choose anything. There are like these two huge pipes. One is the Yandex pipe, another is Google pipe. And it's also our, well, responsibility maybe that during the last decades, all or almost all news outlets, they were very interested in this traffic. And even this word traffic has nothing human inside. It's something like, it's even worse than a crowd. It's like a flow of I don't know what. and they were treated like traffic or like crowds, and they behave like crowds right now. And maybe another thing that I want to mention is that there was a question why in such a huge country the paywall models were not successful at all. At the moment, we have very few news or analytic resources in Russia that are working on the paywall. Maybe just the Republic, the Village, and the Banderzin that have one owner, and some other like formally business newspaper like Vedomosti. I'm not sure if they are under paywall or not. And I believe that the connection or the I would say I mean it's similar to the fact that no brand, there is almost no news affinity among the Russian audience. So no one, not just poor or greedy, but it's hard to explain why you should pay to the news sources you even don't know their names, and that's how I see it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lev. And that's interesting. Your point about the influence of technology platforms that can, to some extent, segment the audience. And we have been accustomed to think that, for example, the audience of Odnoklassniki is more readily like to these propaganda messages than the audience of Telegram, but it's a very naive idea that we can understand in these terms the detailed question. And before I ask Vasily to give some details of what we know about the values of the Russian population as news consumers and their readiness to accept these or those messages, I would like to greet Elaine Monaghan, who has joined us. Thank you for joining us. And we have been discussing the new stage of development of the Russian media sphere. So, Elaine, please, could you tell something about your perspective on the current state of affairs in Russian news media? Please.
Thank you so much, Ilya. And I just have to apologize for appearing late to this discussion, which was completely my fault and not anyone else's miscommunication. I just had the time completely wrong, which I'm very disappointed about because I'm already intrigued by this discussion. I should probably say a little bit about my perspective before I share my thoughts. So I am from Scotland, as you can probably hear. I majored in Russian and German at the University of Glasgow and graduated a horrifyingly long time ago in 1993, and fled my PhD program and became a journalist. I ran away to join the ranks of journalism. And because of my Russian, I was fortunate enough to be sent to Moscow as my first assignment in 1994. And I spent, I'm telling you this because I want to give you my the context for my perspective on this conversation. I spent the next 3 years living in Moscow and Kiev, so during the presidencies of Boris Yeltsin and Leonid Kuchma and of Alexander Lukashenko, because I was responsible also for covering Belarus, which tells you a lot about the realities of journalism, because clearly I'm an expert in none of the above things. Despite having majored in Russian and having the language and obviously some cultural context and knowledge of history and so on. So fast forward to today, obviously it's a very different kind of picture that we're seeing, but my perspective of it is very much colored by my time living in the countries I just mentioned in the 90s. So coincidentally, I am currently working again for Reuters you know, in a monitoring editorial role, helping to support the network of people who are covering events in Ukraine and in Russia. And, you know, obviously in a very different way. I'm not in the field any longer. I'm covering the story, you know, using the same tools that our audiences are using, and that includes audiences in Russia. Because even though, as we all know, the majority of Russians are still receiving their news through television, which is, you know, government controlled, there are still ways to get news in other places. And one of the places that Russians are getting what you could call information, perhaps more accurately, of course, is on Telegram, which is also a place where journalists are heavily active, because it's another, we have to be monitoring what's happening on there in order to try to understand what's happening in the news. And if you, well, what's happening in the field. If you look at any current external or international news source that's covering events in Ukraine and frankly in Russia, you will often see channels from Telegram sourced. So I guess I think you're talking about, you know, how have audiences changed? I mean, I want to just say, having not lived in Russia for so long, I'm very hesitant to opine on this. But what I can say is that on the one hand, it seems that audiences are that it's harder for audiences to obtain independent information. And on the other hand, there's this kind of paradox where there's a lot of internet access. So, you know, audiences could go out and get information independently, but, you know, human beings tend not to behave like that. And so you know, I'd be very interested, and I'm sure people are doing this already, to see what the impact is of this kind of explosion of information on Telegram, and how many Russians are actually accessing that information, and how they're, you know, operating within that ecosystem. You know, what kinds of fact checking are they doing independently? I mean, I think that would be interesting to see. Whether the sort of psychological aspect of it, I mean, my view on this is somewhat colored by, obviously, people I've met in my academic life now. I've been teaching journalism at Indiana University since 2014, and one of the people I met during this time is a French-Russian journalist named Elaine Monaghan, who studies the use of propaganda in Kremlin communication. And I think it's fair to say that the tight control through television has helped the Kremlin to control its messaging around the war in a way that could perhaps be interpreted as explaining a lot of the outcomes that we're seeing. And so I don't know if that answers your question, Ilya, but perhaps it goes a little way towards framing you know, a sense of how things have changed there in Russia in the years since the Yeltsin period, when it seemed as if you know, we were entering into a kind of wild, free communication space, and now we're living in an ecosystem of a very heavily controlled one, where, you know, journalists in exile is sort of the theme of the day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elaine. It's interesting to reflect on the role of Telegram channels, indeed. And actually, we have Telegram channels belonging to all the sides of the spectrum, both right-wing and also independent media. They have the information there. But what I would like to emphasize is the fact that very often some raw materials for the news are just videos shot by smartphones, by regular people who are either like in the right place in the right moment, or just participants of the events. So very often today, especially when it is news about the Ukrainian war, we have the news accompanied, just consisting of a video clip shot by a participant of the events. So to some extent is a new trend. And I it's not just a question for the participants, but I would like just to mention this problem, how the journalists and big media agencies like Reuters, how they are using this kind of material, and how this crowdsourcing of grassroots level sources can contribute to the production of the news and the framing. And sometimes we can observe very interesting phenomenon when the same video is framed differently by pro-Kremlin sources and by independent media. So, but let us get back to the discussion of the audiences, their values and their readiness to accept this or that kind of messages. So I would like to ask Vasily to comment on this. What we know about the current state of the Russian audiences?
I would make one step back to your comment about kind of public participants in news video production, video news production. That is not a new phenomenon. It started with Arab Spring. It's been pretty much appropriated in the right meaning of this word by many news agencies. There have been several organizations, they were startups, they're not anymore, that verified these videos, making them vetted for public use, or not vetted, therefore becoming fakes. And in general, kind of this, I mean, Reuters, for example, deals with Storyful. I think it's their property now. Associated Press has also bought similar startup in America, so that that is known. This is not a new thing. What Ukrainian war demonstrated, which is really interesting and which needs to be studied specifically, is how strategic communications invade this area of personal videos, kind of using them as the channel for well, legitimate propaganda. I mean, legitimate meaning that they show Russian atrocities, they show kind of the success of Ukrainian armies. I'm speaking about Ukrainian Stratcom, and that is a very interesting. This is phenomenon. This wasn't done by anybody before. So coming back to your question, recently was during summer, fall last year, kind of a very respected British survey organization has conducted a series of polls to diagnose what happens with Russian audiences and how they are segmented, and what's the difference between the segments in relation to media consumption. The survey didn't discover anything sort of particularly new. The society, as it was expected, is pretty much segmented the same way like Engelhardt model predicts. Yeah, there are people on extreme conservative side with a very kind of old-fashioned values, which in the Engelhardt kind of matrix would be kind of collectivism and collective responsibility, but in the particular kind of media dimension, it's people that are deaf to anything else except propaganda, and people who aggressively confront others who have not even opposite opinion, just other opinion. Then there is a segment of silent majority, which could be kind of interpreted like 40% of the total. And this 40% are kind of divided by different type of the consciousness. I mean, people with open consciousness, then those who are ready to listen to others' arguments, and people who are state captured. They probably hear other arguments, but they don't, in their answers, they don't represent anything except sort of state-vetted propaganda language. So their language is so standard in their responses that you cannot imagine that people really think so. I mean, they use similar wordings, they use similar even accents. I mean, in translating the information. And then there is kind of on the liberal part of the spectrum, there is three groups that are very different in terms of their political values, because of course there are kind of right-wing liberals with kind of very high attention to ideas of liberal democracy and capitalism and all kind of the issues of human rights and so on. There is a leftist group which is different from, of course, from kind of right-wing liberals, and there is an interesting group that is usually observed in Nordic countries, is people who are against everything. I mean, people who are like rejecting every organized narrative. I think Scotland also has quite a big chunk of these people. They're anarchists, really kind of this is a modern type of anarchist. So this is how audience is segmented. Neither part has majority. I mean, the largest one would be the silent middle with 40%. And the other kind of two have like 25 with small chunks in between. This is developing, but interestingly, it's not developing as you expect. I mean, you would expect that ongoing war, kind of large number of victims, worsening economic situation, anyway worsening. I mean, whatever Russia claims, it doesn't feel the sanctions, should open eyes to people on the kind of conservative part of the spectrum. No. Those groups that exist, they only become more entrenched in their vision, and the central group grows slowly but constantly. Kind of the last, I think the last data was December, and it shows that kind of the silent majority, these two parts of silent majority, grew to 47-48%, which is just above the margin of error, but that's the fact. I mean, so the sufferings of Russian people do not turn them from propaganda. They still are listening to it, and they don't kind of they don't turn to alternative sources yet. Also, I just kind of ending it up. I mean, hopefully, media researchers and sociologists would be able to continue one way or another to do surveys in Russia, clandestine, but real surveys, and not turn to the ideas of radio liberty in 1950s and 60s that needed to kind of to monitor whether anyone listens to Voice of America and Radio Liberty. Do you know the story about that? I don't think this is well known. Nobody else than Peterim Sorokin developed for them a special technology that they were making questionnaires for Soviet people who've been in small numbers traveling, tourists and people who've been participating in scientific congresses, exhibitions, theater tours, and so on. So these were questionnaires that allowed sociologists to transpose that into the amount of listening of foreign radio stations, foreign broadcasts in Soviet Union, which of course, I mean, every one of us who has a bit of knowledge of polling understands it's just nothing else than astrology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasily. These 2 points are very interesting indeed and thought-provoking, that of strengthening the attitudes with changing the situation, and another thing having to do with so-called foreign voices. This story about polling the visitors of the Soviet tourists resonates with the KGB polling for tourists returning from abroad and preventing these contacts with pollsters. And before we give the opportunity to our audience to ask their questions, I would like to ask the last thing to Elaine, and it has to do with the topic that Vasily has mentioned, these foreign voices like Voice of America, Radio Liberty, BBC, Russian Service, Deutsche Welle, and so on. We know that in the Soviet Union, despite of jamming, that was an important source of information. And those people who were watching Soviet television, watching films or Spokojной Noci, Малыши, they still got their news not from Программа Время, but from Radio Liberty. So, Elaine, to your mind, what are the perspectives for these foreign-based and foreignly financed news sources with respect to their influence on Russian audience? What factors seem to you most important to understand their influence and their penetration? Could you just reflect a bit, comparing the situation that was like in the Soviet times? It was quite different in 1990s when everything has changed. It seemed that Radio Liberty will be on air just in your radio, in car radio, but it was not so long a period. So what would you think?
That's such a great question. I'm sort of tempted to throw the conversation back to something that Vasily said, which is still making me laugh because it's so apt, about my country being filled with anarchists when it comes to accepting. I think you were talking about from a layperson perspective, the idea of like accepting messages or adhering to certain sources of information. And I'm like, but Vasily, we've only just met. And I think that there's a sort of a truth in there somewhere that I suspect probably answers your question, Ilya, that, without understanding the audience, you cannot hope to know how to achieve audience penetration. And I guess for me, that's maybe the biggest problem here, that how do you collect accurate sociological information in the context like the one we have right now in Russia. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there doing it. I'm not one of them. I don't have that expertise, but I mean, I guess sort of thinking of it in a sort of historical arc kind of way. You know, right now, again, picking up on this theme of Telegram and what we call user-generated content, you know, these videos and so on that people are sharing, we're obviously in a very different kind of landscape where there's fierce competition for every eyeball. And I'm sure the same would be true in the Russian context, regardless of who's trying to reach those eyeballs. You know, like you can passively reach a lot of people, but if it's a very passive experience, how much are you really influencing them? And, you know, if people don't begin to believe what they're seeing or don't feel an affinity to what they're seeing, they're not going to consume the content. So I guess if I were running, you know, an organization like Radio Liberty right now, trying to reach an audience in Russia, what would I be thinking about? Well, I'd be thinking about, you know, what do they actually need and want? What is the kind of quality information that this audience actually needs and wants? And that's a very complicated question in a context of war, because of course people are looking for things that will satisfy their need to avoid emotional and psychological discomfort. So how do you overcome that? People don't want to hear horrible news day in, day out, over and over again. You know, so how are you going to reach audiences with information that will engage them and inform them and support their, you know, efforts to live in a society that's currently obviously under a great deal of stress? So I'm not sure I'm answering your question really, Ilya. I think I'm trying to say that there are many psychological and practical considerations in answering a question like that. And Vasily's reference to kind of, you know, audience norms in a certain time seem very important. And I'm thinking at the same time about, you know, the story of Poland and during the war when, you know, obviously that was a situation as well where getting information from somewhere else, from sources in exile, was obviously terribly important. And maybe it's the exile word that seems important to me right now. Like, you know, people will want to know that their information is coming from a source that they might feel an affinity for. And I don't know how you do that in the kind of context that we have in Russia today. But Ilya, if you've got the answer, tell us, because lots of people would like to know.
I think that at best we can approach to the discussion of right questions, not exactly giving the answers. And unfortunately, I love the way we are discussing, and I would gladly continue this talk for many hours repeatedly. But unfortunately, we have almost run out of time, and at best we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So please, if anyone has some questions to ask to Lev, Vasily, and Elaine, please feel free to raise your hand or just use the chat. Oh, yes, I see a hand. Stanislav, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, very rookie mistake. Thanks everyone for the presentation. So my question, I'm Stanislav Budnitsky. I'm currently, last year was a postdoc at the Russian Studies Workshop. I'm currently at the Wilson Center. My question is about YouTube. So basically, why do the panelists think it has not been banned yet? What are the pros and cons of banning it in the eyes of the Russian authorities? And do you think it will be banned sooner rather than later? And again, why, if so, and if not, also, you know, why you think so? And I guess relatedly, the fact that RooTube has undergone this like revamping since the start of the war, like what effect does that have on the chances of YouTube being banned? Like, are they just basically trying to develop RooTube to the point where they think it can, you know, replace YouTube, or at least to some extent? Thank you.
Stanislav, do you have a particular person in mind to whom to ask this
No,
question?
whoever has any thoughts on this.
Before I route this question, yes, to Vasily, I would like to emphasize that this question is part of a wider topic about all these bans imposed on independent media that during the previous stage of the development of Russian authoritarianism had an important function of a valve, just not letting the pressure of a protest to become too high. And now when Echo Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta, and some others are just closed in their previous state, there is no valve. So closing the access to YouTube would be a part of this wider process. So either a logic in this behavior from the authorities. Vasily.
The answer is very simple. It's because of children.
Oh.
And YouTube has the largest collection of cartoons, multfilmy, and neither RooTube nor VK has anything comparable. Therefore, I mean, shutting down access to YouTube will immediately anger millions of parents in Russia, and that is pretty much easily calculated. So that's the answer. Will they, with development of their own video platforms, attempt to ban Google services? Possibly, but I don't see this possibility this year, or probably even next year. So, and then it's the anecdote about Shah, Donkey, and myself, who dies first.
Thank you, Vasily. This answer gives us some hope, but well, we think about the Shah or Donkey to die. But the logic in these bans that make it more difficult for a big segment of the audience to get their views expressed in some way. So if we are inclined to find logic and some reason behind all the Russian authorities' decisions, we should probably be not right here, because it's I have no answer to this question whether it's a particular logic, but Lev.
Yeah, first of all, I fully agree with Vasily. It's my answer that I constantly repeat about banning, although a lot of my colleagues disagree with me and they await a ban of YouTube, but still I believe that before the real state of war is declared in Russia, and so before Putin really says that we're at war and everything changes, I don't believe it's much more difficult than just this partial mobilization and sending grown-ups to death, because a lot of families, it's their way of free of charge babysitting, and millions of families actually concerned. But secondly, I'd like to thank Stanislav for this question, because it definitely makes sense. In Russia, there are only two unbanned, really significant channels of information, like Telegram and YouTube. And YouTube is even more powerful because, well, it's easier. The perception of the information is easier. You don't have to read. You don't have to analyze. It's just the signal gets directly to your brain, to your conscious, whatever. And a lot of, as you mentioned, Leah, a lot of deleted or canceled radio stations and TV channels, they kept living in YouTube. A lot of TV journalists launched and started their own TV channels. For example, Echo Moskvy grew into, I don't know, tens of maybe YouTube channels. And of course, it's a threat, or it's a potential threat to Kremlin, because, well, a lot of so-called fakes and in reality, a lot of very important truth about war crimes or just war events on the front, and some other important information about the casualties among civil society in Ukraine, among Russian soldiers, and so on, are spread in quite popular YouTube channels. But it's easy, both in Telegram and in YouTube, to estimate the number of real audience. Yeah, and these numbers are still, as I see it, still pretty low in comparison with even with the audience of this state propaganda websites that they receive, thanks to Yandex and, surprisingly and scary, Google, that's still spreading a huge part of the propaganda on the Russian soil. Well, there is logic in banning YouTube, and maybe we'll see it, but once again, I agree with Vasily that they are too weak at the moment to make this really important and scary step.
We have another question from Alexei. Alexei.
Hello. Yeah, you hear me? Thank you very much for all speakers. But I have the questions which concerns me as being Ukrainian, actually. I think it's more to Vasily, but if someone want to have some thoughts about it, I'd like to hear it. I mean, the question is, keeping in mind all these trends about the audience in Russia, all these narratives dominate there. Is there any chances that after the end of the war, we won't have another one in 5 years or a decade? And I understand that the question is rhetoric to some extent, but what could be done in media area to prevent it? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei, for the question. I think that every one of us is thinking about this, but I doubt that we have a ready-made question. Please, who would like
answer
to?
You mean?
Yeah. Answer to this question. So please share your thoughts. If any step in the media development could contribute to the elimination of the threat of the next war. But I would start from the idea that it is not a media, it is indirectly related to the media, because it all depends on the situation with the Russian state and the power in Russia.
Yeah, Ilya, I mean, I've been studying this problem for quite a while, which is much less kind of academic subject, but analytical. The So I agree with you that most of kind of practical answers here are not in media's hands, but in kind of hands of politicians. And we have several examples, I mean, not many, but several examples, when abrupt change of policy resulted kind of similarly abrupt change of media narratives. And then we kind of can observe the reaction of the audiences to this U-turns, let's say, in media. It seems that as soon as you stop propagating certain thing, not even kind of start propagating counter thing, but just stop pushing a certain artificially designed narrative into brains of the audience, it takes about 3 months for people to get back to their senses and start demonstrate a variety of views on the subject. Kind of the only condition is that this propaganda tunnel should stop. In 3 months, there'll be different variety of opinions again, and the kind of the military fervor, or I mean support to the war will wane, and if remains only in very kind of radical and insignificant marginal groups. That's general answer. Particular answer is that kind of the atmosphere of warmongering, of constant, I will say in Russian, because I think many of you understand, почесывание of an imperial vows, of course, is creating abnormal, I mean, illogical reactions in Russian audience. And people are not themselves. I mean, they kind of enchanted with this resentment and kind of military illusions. So that's the first half, and the second half is that it will be also a significant effort from Ukrainian side to at least neutralize relations with Russians, not normalize, but neutralize, move from dehumanizing of Russians, which is necessary today to help the defending nation to defend itself, moving to something else. I mean, I don't know what. I mean, but it shouldn't be as it worded now. Yeah, orki, Rusnya, and so on is not a good way of finding future neutrality. I mean, we don't want. I mean, I have both origins. I mean, Russian and Ukrainian. I mean, for me, this war is terrible. I mean, my Ukrainian part is from Poltava. My Jewish part is from Minsk and Russia. So, I mean, I don't belong to this war, but the fact is that for many people, Ukrainian propaganda also reaches them, and not always works to make relations better. Let me be very careful in wording that.
So let us hope that the war will stop first, and then we will see some U-turns. It's a good result of our discussion indeed, and it has been full, like we had many very valuable ideas. It was very thought-provoking. So I would like to thank so much all the participants. Thank you to you, Elaine. Thank you, Lev, and thank you, Vasily. Thank you for joining us, and let us hope that some kind of cooperation between us will go on, at least mentally, because of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you also to the audience. There is a message from Elaine. I just want to comment. Oh, Elaine, please.
I didn't want to slow everyone down because I know you're trying to stop, but I was just, first of all, it's such a painful question, but such an important one. But I just wanted to pick up on a word that Vasily used of dehumanization, and say, how powerful the idea of humanization is in media everywhere. And if there's a slogan for everything that we're talking about, it has to be that humanization.
Thank you. So I think we will stop here.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
The recording, a video record will be available on YouTube and will be posted on social media. So if you'd like to return to some things discussed, you are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to see you all.
Thank you.